The smell of burnt grease, the shouting of demanding customers, and the incessant beep-beep of an overloaded fryer, all blended into a chaotic symphony of a fast food restaurant at peak hours. Amidst it all, a middle-aged man in a simple uniform quietly wiped down a food tray. Today, he was just an ordinary man in a plain uniform, worn-out sneakers, and a fake name, Rick. No one recognized him. No one knew that this new employee was actually Richard Donovan, the CEO of the entire chain. No one realized that he was the very person who had built this place from the ground up, and today, he was about to uncover a heartbreaking truth he had never imagined. Richard had spent his life building this empire from nothing, but lately, sales had been declining, negative reviews flooded social media, and he felt like he was losing control. So he made a decision to check things out himself, unannounced, without any fanfare. Just a new employee, starting his first shift. The moment he stepped into the kitchen, Richard could feel the tension in the air. A young employee, barely in his 20s, was scrubbing a towering pile of dishes, exhaustion evident in his eyes. The cashier let out a weary sigh, her face filled with frustration as she dealt with one difficult customer after another. As he entered the break room, he overheard a conversation inside. A middle-aged man with a scruffy beard was speaking angrily. "I'm sick of this place. Management doesn't care about us at all. They cut our hours, make us do twice the work, but the pay stays the same. I've been here 7 years, and I've never gotten a real raise. And the big boss, probably sitting in some fancy office, completely clueless about how miserable we have it here." Another employee, a woman who seemed to have been there for a while, lowered her voice. "That's not even the worst part. Last time, I burned my hand making fries, and when I asked for a day off, the manager kept pressuring me to come in anyway. The fryer keeps breaking, and no matter how many times we report it, they ignore us. All they care about is profit." Richard froze. His heart clenched at those words. He had always believed he had built a good company, a place where employees were valued. But now, he was faced with a harsh reality. The hardest working people in his company felt abandoned. The shift continued, and Richard silently observed. An 18-year-old boy, his face glistening with sweat, was busy grilling patties. Suddenly, he dropped a bun onto the floor. His face turned pale, and he quickly bent down to pick it up. Richard stopped him. "Wait. You don't have to do that." The boy panicked. I'm sorry, but if I throw it away, the manager will dock my pay." A surge of anger rose within Richard. What was this? Why was an employee so afraid over a small mistake? That night, after his shift, Richard drove home, his heart heavy. He had thought of himself as a good leader, but it turned out he knew nothing about what was really happening on the ground. He had given too much power to heartless managers, ones who cared only about numbers and forgot about the people. The next morning, Richard returned, but this time, he was no longer Rick. He walked into the manager's office in his familiar black suit, and the once arrogant supervisors turned pale. He didn't say much. He had gathered the documents, the complaints, and the evidence of employee mistreatment and exploitation. Several high-ranking managers were fired on the spot. But he didn't stop there. Richard called for an emergency meeting with all the employees. "I've heard you. I've seen what you go through. And I'm sorry." His voice trembled. "I let this happen, and I won't let it continue." Immediately, a series of new policies were introduced. Wage increases, better working conditions, equipment repairs, and most importantly, a confidential hotline allowing employees to report issues directly to him without fear of retaliation. A few weeks later, Richard returned to the same branch. The atmosphere had completely changed. The staff no longer looked tense. Instead, there were smiles. The boy at the grill looked more confident now, and the cashier who had burned her hand had received fair compensation. One employee approached him and whispered, "Thank you for truly listening." But it wasn't over yet. 3 weeks later, an anonymous email landed in his personal inbox. It contained only one sentence. "Do you really think everything is fine now? Try visiting store number 87. A chill ran down Richard's spine. Store number 87? It was one of the highest grossing locations, and he had never received a single complaint from there. But that was precisely what unsettled him. If there was a problem, why hadn't anyone spoken up? Without warning, Richard decided to become a new employee once again. The moment he stepped into store number 87, he knew something was wrong. The employees worked like machines, silent, expressionless, moving stiffly through their tasks. When Richard casually tried to befriend a young female employee, she only gave him a fearful glance, shook her head, and whispered, "Don't ask anything, or you'll get into trouble." That night, Richard stayed late to observe, and what he saw sent chills down his spine. Parker, the store manager, was openly yelling at an employee for being too slow, then forced him to work an extra 2 hours without pay. When another worker complained about expired food, Parker simply smirked. "You have two choices. Do as I say or find another job." The next morning, Richard walked into Parker's office, not as an employee this time, but as the CEO himself. "I've seen enough," Richard said in a low voice. "Did you really think you could hide your abuse forever?" Parker scoffed, trying to keep his composure. "I have no idea what you're talking about, sir." Richard silently took out a USB drive and placed it on the desk. It contained all the recordings and footage he had gathered over the past few days. "And here is the evidence. I can take this to the authorities right now." That afternoon, in front of all the employees of store number 87, Parker bowed his head and admitted everything. Murmurs spread through the crowd, anger, disbelief, and even tears from those who had endured too much for too long. As Parker walked out in disgrace, Richard stepped forward and said, "I failed to protect you, and I'm sorry. But I promise you this, from now on, there will be no more Parkers in our system." With Parker gone, store number 87 began to change. A new, fairer manager was appointed. The employees no longer worked in fear, and smiles gradually returned. A month later, when Richard visited the branch again, a young employee hesitantly approached him and asked, "Mr. Donovan, why are you doing all this? Someone as wealthy as you could just sit in an office and ignore everything." Richard gave a small smile. "Because a company cannot thrive if the people within it are not treated fairly. I don't just want a successful business. I want a business that people are proud to work for." This time, Richard left with a smile. At last, he truly understood what made a company valuable, not just profit, but people. A month after removing Parker and restructuring the management system at store number 87, Richard Donovan sat in his office, staring at the map of the United States hanging on the wall. Dotted across it were the red marks representing the current locations of the fast food chain he had painstakingly built. But today, his mind wasn't just focused on what already existed, it was looking toward the future. He wanted to expand the chain further, but this time, not just for profit. He wanted to create a system where no one had to endure exploitation, where employees were treated as people, not as machines working tirelessly without recognition. And so, instead of sitting in his office making decisions from afar, Richard packed a backpack, put on a simple button-down shirt, and set out for the most remote corners of the country. He wanted to see firsthand the struggles that workers were facing, to understand the lives of those still waiting for an opportunity they had never been given. His first stop was a small southern town, home to a family-owned diner that had been around for over 40 years. The owner, an elderly man named Marcus, eyed him up and down before chuckling. "You don't look like a corporate boss at all." Richard laughed. He had grown used to such reactions. Marcus explained that the town had once thrived, thanks to a large factory that employed hundreds of people. But when the factory shut down, the town lost its primary source of income. Other fast food chains had tried opening there before, but they never lasted more than a few months, leaving behind unemployed workers and broken promises. They come in, make their money, then leave. How do I know you're any different? Richard remained silent. He knew words alone wouldn't earn trust. Only actions could. 2 months later, the first location in Richard's new expansion plan was born, right in that small town. But it was unlike any of his previous branches. Instead of hiring employees on short-term contracts, he partnered with the local community, training those who had been unemployed, giving them a chance to learn and grow. He didn't just create jobs, he committed to reinvesting the store's profits back into the town, funding libraries, improving schools, and supporting struggling families. On opening day, Marcus stood in the new restaurant, looking around thoughtfully. "You actually did it." Richard nodded. "I once failed to listen to my employees. I don't want to make that mistake again." Marcus was quiet for a long moment before finally extending his hand. "Welcome to the family." From that small town, Richard kept moving, venturing into struggling neighborhoods, into places other businesses had long abandoned. Each new store wasn't just another business location. It was an opportunity to change lives. In an old industrial city, he hired former factory workers and trained them in new skills. In an immigrant-heavy district, he partnered with local organizations to ensure that every employee had proper benefits, no matter where they came from. A year later, when he looked back, Richard realized his company hadn't just expanded in size, it had expanded in meaning. This time, he wasn't just a CEO. He was a listener, a builder, a creator of something greater than profit margins. One evening, when he returned to store number 87, a young employee who had once worked there hesitated before asking, "Mr. Donovan, why are you doing all of this?" Richard looked at him, then at the other employees, people he had once overlooked but who had now become an essential part of this journey. He smiled. Because a company cannot truly succeed if the people within it aren't treated fairly. "I don't just want a chain of restaurants, I want a legacy." This time, as Richard walked away, he carried with him an unshakable certainty. Real change doesn't come from speeches or policies written on paper. It comes from people who are willing to listen, to act, and to make a difference.